Right, okay, folks, back again. Another week, another episode. So, we're coming up to 70 episodes with this podcast now, and the reason I embarked on this whole journey to begin with, this podcast, the whole getting involved in mental health, was because of anxiety. Anxiety was the thing that sort of tore me down and ripped my life to pieces, and, well, I mean, that pretty much says it all, to be honest. And so I tried to make, because anxiety was sort of the inspiration for this, I tried to make anxiety an episode on it very early on. I wanted it to be episode 2. Episode 1 was depression. I wanted to make anxiety episode 2. And there's no sort of deeper reason for it not working out and taking this long than admin, basically. So I've been inviting people for the past 2 years, trying to schedule something. Loads of different people, loads of different universities around the world. It's just never happened. Schedule issues and, people wanting to do like short 10-minute interviews, which, we don't really do here. Anyway, I'm glad it's worked out like that, because even though I've been speaking to sort of suitable candidates for the job, I managed to stumble across the perfect candidate for the job. And quite frankly, I don't know how I didn't discover him sooner, because he happens to be a close colleague of Adrian Wells, who I've spoken about on this podcast a few times, because he's the guy that developed MCT, metacognitive therapy, which was the therapy that sort of clicked for me and helped me sort my head out. So, let's get to it. My guest today is Professor Graham Davey. Graham is Emeritus Professor of Psychology at the University of Sussex, who has published over 140 articles in scientific and professional journals, and has served as President of the British Psychological Society, and is currently Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Experimental Psychopathology and Psychopathology Review. He is the author of the Psychology Today blog, Why We Worry, Where Anxiety Comes From, and What We Can Do About It. And he has written or edited a number of books, including Worry and Its Psychological Disorders, Managing Anxiety with CBT for Dummies, and the book which forms the basis of today's discussion, and which should be available by the time this episode airs, which is The Anxiety Epidemic, The Causes of Our Modern Day Anxieties. So, Graham, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me. Okay, so I'm going to jump in straight away with this question, which is, I know from experience, there's about, I'd say, maybe about 50 billion books out there on anxiety already. 95% of them are crap, if I'm honest. I've read a good percentage of them. So why write another? Let's start with that. What was sort of missing from the conversation that inspired you to weigh in on this topic?
Yeah, there are millions of books out there on anxiety, but most of them are actually really about self-help books. And I wanted to write something that was just a little bit different. I wanted to write something that gave the reader an insight into the causes of anxiety. So this would cover modern-day environmental factors that cause anxiety, what kinds of experiences we have today that we maybe didn't have in previous generations that cause our anxiety. And then also to look in detail at the detailed causes, psychological causes of anxiety. How does the way that we think affect whether we experience anxiety or not? And I wanted to do this in an accessible and engaging way as I can, and in some detail, so that I can give the reader a fairly accessible update on the causes of not just anxiety, but the causes of all of the major anxiety disorders as well.
Why do you think that? Because I'd agree from the books I've read on anxiety, because I just became obsessed with the topic while I was going through it. And I won't make that usual bullshit boast that everyone makes that they've read thousands or hundreds of books, but certainly dozens. And I'd agree that the cause of anxiety is often skipped over. Have you got any suspicions why that is? Why we just sort of, don't worry about the cause so much, and which to me seems a massive, obvious factor that needs discussing, but it often isn't. Why do you think that is?
No, you're absolutely right. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. I think one is that clinical psychologists, bless them, are trained and professionally focus their work on helping people. They don't have a lot of time to do research, or many of them, or most of them don't have a lot of time to do research. So they're rather less interested in discovering the causes of conditions like anxiety than they are in treating them. And that was always an issue, even when in the 1980s we were first developing cognitive behavioral therapies. One of the major issues there was, what was interesting were the factors that were maintaining anxiety, not the factors that caused them. And so CBT was aimed, and still is aimed, fairly specifically at the maintaining factors. So understanding the causes wasn't crucial in any way. But I've been lucky and privileged enough to be a research psychologist for most of my working career, and doing research on anxiety. And in the book, I also talk about my own anxiety issues and anxiety problems, and understanding the causes through doing research for me was a massively important thing. It helped me to understand where my anxiety was coming from, and helped me, most importantly, to manage it. So I do see that understanding the causes of where anxiety comes from can be very enlightening and very helpful. And again, I mention that specifically in the book, in the sense that in the book I do give quite a few examples of ways in which you can help yourself to manage your anxiety issues and your anxiety problems. But the first step is really about understanding the causes.
So, okay, let's jump into that a little bit, because I'm interested in. I usually start with this question actually about why people decided on a particular field of research. So, have we got sort of a chicken egg scenario going on there? Was it your own anxiety issues which sort of inspired you to research it, or did the anxiety come after as a result of being a researcher?
Yes, I know what you mean. Yeah, there are certainly many times when I've been highly anxious about my work. But no, I have a kind of strange and rather odd history when it comes to how I got into anxiety research. I originally started my research as an academic and studying experimental psychology. I'm not a therapist. I was mainly interested in learning theory, and I was doing conditioning experiments on animals. And after about 5 years of doing that, it became clear to me that there was only me and 4 other people in the world interested in what I was doing.
Right.
So I thought, no, that's not going to last me a lifetime. I thought so. And there was a beginning of interest in how conditioning theory and Pavlovian type theories could actually explain certain mental health problems like anxiety. And so I started to transfer my knowledge of conditioning to understanding how anxiety might be acquired and how phobias might be acquired. And that was the first sort of topic that I went into. And it soon became apparent there were a lot more people interested in what I was doing when it was about how we learnt to be anxious than there were before. And also, I felt that I was offering something. I was offering some research that would have some impact and that would help people. And that wasn't necessarily the case before. So that's my odd history. And through that route to starting off by looking at how phobias might be conditioned, I moved on to other anxiety topics such as OCD, and also very specifically to pathological worrying as well as anxiety generally.
So what's your deal, your story with struggling with anxiety?
Well, I started off as an anxious child. I was a very shy, anxious child. Then I became a very anxious adolescent, as you do in those circumstances. Again, very shy, and very anxious about most things. And then an anxious adult. I mean, I've had 2 periods in my life where I suffered panic disorder. Specifically, and so I certainly know how debilitating that condition can be. And interestingly, the first time that I experienced panic attacks, and then they began to come on a daily basis, was around 1980. And of course, at that time, there was nothing in the diagnostic manuals called panic disorder.
All right.
So it was quite frightening, and still is quite frightening for people who don't understand what it is. Of course, I went to my GP. The GP said, well, I think you've got an inner ear problem or something like that, which I didn't think very much of. And then I started doing my first lectures on anxiety, and to my classes when I was at university in London. And there I came across this thing called panic. And as soon as I recognized it, and as soon as I began to understand what it was, and then in 1980, I think panic disorder did become a diagnostic category in the DSM. And then as soon as I understood what it was, it disappeared. And that's one of the reasons why I think that understanding the causes of your anxiety can be very, very rewarding, can be so important in helping you to overcome these things.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because you see, your story, your background is the complete opposite of mine. Because I wasn't an anxious child at all. I was very confident, very outgoing, and then as a teenager, I became like a bit of a sort of very hard-nosed and stoic as a teenager. So anxiety wasn't even on my radar. So when it kicked in at I was 30 years old, it was just. Mm-hmm. But that's I suppose we'll get to all this, but that just sort of speaks to the nature of it, I guess, about how I don't know how sort of complex it is. I guess so. We have to sort of sometimes guilty of skipping ahead with these conversations, especially ones that I know a little bit about. Let's go back to basics, I guess. And so first question, I guess, on it would be, your most cited research paper is one called "Some Characteristics of Worrying: Evidence for Worrying and Anxiety as Separate Constructs." Yeah. So I guess a good place to start would be actually defining anxiety as a disorder, as distinct from just having butterflies in your stomach over doing your driving test, and then distinguishing it from things like worrying. Anxiety is often described as worry, as synonymous. Yeah. So I'll hand that over to you.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, when we're looking how to define anxiety, as a disorder, is we have to be aware and we have to be clear that anxiety is basically a normal experience. Everyone experiences anxiety, and it's perfectly normal. It's an evolved emotion that comes along with us. So we shouldn't be automatically medicalizing it, but there are clearly times when anxiety does get on top of you, and when you start to define anxiety as a problem or a condition or a disorder, you define it by 2 things, and you do this with most mental health problems. There are 2 things to define this. One is that your anxiety is disrupting your normal daily living. So your anxiety means that you can't work effectively, you can't learn efficiently if you're a student, you can't socialize normally, or if you're a parent, you can't look after your family properly. So it's disabling and disrupting in that way. And the second definition is that it's distressing. Suddenly, anxiety can go from being a mildly irritating and negative emotion to being distressing on a minute by minute, day by day basis. And when that happens, of course, then it is a problem that you should be seeking some kind of help with.
How is it then distinct from worry? What separates anxiety from worry?
Yeah, I think worry is more of a way of coping with. It's a coping response. Anxiety is basically an emotion. So anxiety is a very broad thing. It's an odd emotion because it's very complex. Most emotions that we have are very specific emotions that deal with something immediate. So fear, anger, happiness, surprise, these are all emotions that deal with something that's occurred immediately. The thing about anxiety is that it's a kind of almost like a medium-term emotion where we can see some threats and challenges in the distance, somewhere in the distance, and we anticipate them. And what we then try and do is to try and deal with them in some way. And that's what anxiety is. It's a complex emotion like that. And it differs from worry because worry is you trying to think up solutions. So worry is one particular way of dealing with future threats and challenges. Now, some people can worry without being anxious. Some people will worry and they'll say, oh, yeah, no, it's fine. I'm just thinking through this thing or that thing. And they will try and think up possible solutions and so on, different scenarios. And it's no problem for them. For other people, the worrying becomes, if you like, the worrying becomes pathological. They have to think through every single possible scenario that might happen with a future threat or a challenge, and then try to think up ways to do with it, what to do with it. And what you tend to find is that you can worry without being anxious, but if you worry and you are anxious, your anxiety will often thwart your worrying, because we know that people who are anxious are low in confidence. They're low in problem-solving confidence. They have ways of tuning into other threatening things in their life, and they have ways of interpreting ambiguous things as threatening. So the anxiety that you have when you're worrying is something which thwarts effective worry, and in that way, worrying can become pathological, as it does, for example, in certain anxiety disorders, such as generalized anxiety disorder, where worrying is a cardinal diagnostic feature.
Right. Okay. So the title of the book is The Anxiety Epidemic, and that phrase is sort of used a lot at the moment. A depression epidemic and anxiety epidemic. But I was just wondering if you could take a moment to maybe justify the use of the word epidemic, and whether you could sort of quantify that for us. And we'll get to the whys later, but for now, I'm just sort of interested in the who's and the how many's. Yeah,
sure. You're quite right. The word epidemic is used regularly today. It's used mainly in relation, I think, to the increasing numbers of people who are seeking help for mental health problems, and that's true of anxiety as well. And basically, people are seeking, not just adults, but children as well, are all seeking treatment for mental health problems and help with their problems. So one issue might be whether there is an epidemic, if you like, merely because people have become more aware of mental health services and possibly the availability of treatment. In the case of anxiety, I don't think that's necessarily true. And I can give you some kind of figures around anxiety. Epidemiological studies and community surveys tend to suggest that 1 in 14 people worldwide are estimated to be suffering a diagnosable anxiety disorder. If the prevalence figures that we have from large worldwide studies are true, that's a lot of people, 1 in 14 in the world with a disorder. Now, 1 in 9 will have a disorder within any 1 year. So even the level of diagnosable anxiety disorders are very high indeed, and higher than you might expect. But also, let's take a look at how we experience everyday anxiety, and whether that anxiety is high or not. In the book, I've taken a look at the annual population survey, which is carried out each year by the UK Office of National Statistics, and they collect data on anxiety from over 250,000 UK citizens. And what they do is they ask them, on a scale of 0 to 10, how anxious did you feel yesterday? When 0 is not at all anxious, or 10 is very anxious indeed. And these statistics seem to suggest that 1 in 5 people experience anxiety in the high range, which is 6 or 7 to 10. So 1 in 5 people in the UK in that survey have very high anxiety levels on the day before they gave their measure. On the other side of the coin, 2 in 5 seem to suffer no anxiety. So, 40% of the population probably don't experience a lot of anxiety at all, and the remaining 2 in 5 either have medium levels of anxiety, or they tend to have anxiety sometimes, but not at other times. And those figures from the annual population survey seem to mesh quite nicely with what we have from other epidemiological studies, suggesting that very roughly, probably 1 in 5 people are highly anxious, and they may be suffering in some way because of that anxiety and stress. What we don't have, of course, because we haven't been doing these epidemiological studies for long enough, we don't have any idea whether those figures are higher today than they were in the past. And to be honest, I suspect they're about the same, because anxiety is an evolved emotion that people have been experiencing for centuries and generations and generations. So I wouldn't expect the numbers to be particularly different in any previous time. And if you look back at the history of anxiety, you can certainly see that writers over the centuries have often talked about epidemics of anxiety and melancholy, as they used to call it, during their times. And that goes right back to Greek Roman times, the Middle Ages. And there was a gentleman, a writer called George Cheney in 1733. He published a book about the melancholy in the UK, and he called it an epidemic, basically, of melancholy and anxiety. And in 1733, he put that down to living in unhealthy towns, taking up sedentary occupations, poor food, and oddly, too much wealth.
Wow, that's I'm gonna have to dig that one out, Graham. I didn't know. Yeah, the book sort of went back. You sort of always think of psychology going back to Freud, and that there was almost nothing before him. I'm
Oh,
gonna,
yeah.
I'm gonna dig that one out and try and if I can find that on
Mm.
Project Gutenberg, and I'll stick that on in the show notes for people to download and have a look at.
Yeah, no, it is very interesting. You tend to find that issues about anxiety going way back, right to Greek Roman times and so on as well, were all to do with status, were to do with even if there were no major threats in life like starvation, poverty, disease, war, even if there was nothing like that, people would find something to be anxious about. And there are other reports in the 17th and 18th century of people's worries, and I forget the name of the person who wrote this, but he was someone who held in his local village a meeting every day with local villagers and talked about their worries, and their worries were basically about the same things that we worry about: relationships, unrequited love, ill health, death, and so on. So very, very similar.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what. Before it's these modern causes that are the sort of gravitational center of this episode that I want to unpack a bit more. But since we're going back in history, let's keep going all the way back and let's get a bit Darwinian.
Okay.
I'm interested in the evolved purpose of anxiety, its evolutionary origins. What's the point of it? And then also whether it demonstrates any tangible advantages nowadays.
Yeah, sure. Well, like I've said a number of times already, my view of anxiety is that it's an evolved emotion, and we experience it today because it almost certainly has some benefits. Now, the way that most people experience anxiety is very negatively. So, I mean, most people don't see what the benefits of anxiety are. So you have to delve a little bit deeper to see what benefits anxiety has. One of the things we do know that anxiety does is when you're feeling anxious, it tweaks your attentional processes. It makes you automatically attend to anything that might be negative or threatening. And it does that pre-consciously. So before you're aware of it, your anxiety has switched your mind to focusing on something that might be a threat or something that's negative. Now, clearly, that's obviously a good thing. That's something that fear does as well, because it enables you to more quickly deal with that threat or challenge if you're focusing on it. But there are other nice little studies that have shown one or two things that, the benefits that anxiety can have. There are a couple of psychologists from Israel, Sachi Eindor and Olga Tal, and they developed some really imaginative experiments to look at the beneficial effects of anxiety. One of their studies showed that anxious worriers detect the smell of smoke much quicker than non-anxious individuals, and there was a lovely little study where they asked people to do a little computer game, but in the middle of the experiment, the computer broke down, and so they asked the participant to actually go and get a technician to deal with it. And on the way out of the room, they came across various obstacles, like someone asking them to complete a questionnaire, and then someone else dropping some books in front of them. It was always the very anxious individuals who managed to get the technician first and managed to get the technician more quickly to the computer than the non-anxious ones. So again, that's some evidence that there are advantages to being anxious when it comes to getting help. But a very nice study is one which I think really gives you an idea of why anxiety evolved as an adaptive emotion. Is a study that was done about 10 years ago by William Lee at the Institute of Psychiatry, and he looked at the lives of over 5,000 people born in 1946. what he found was that those who had exhibited high levels of anxiety from a very early age were significantly less likely to die an accidental death before the age of 25 than those who were very low anxious. There was no difference between the groups on non-accidental deaths, but a very big, significant difference on accidental deaths. And that's interesting because, if you like, what anxiety is doing, if this study it can be replicated and so on, is that what anxiety is doing has a protective effect until you reach an age of around 25, where it protects you against accidental death anyway, until your reproductive peak. But what they also found was that after 25 years of age, things turned around completely. And if you were high anxiety, then you had an increased risk factor for early mortality from illnesses such as cancer and cardiac disease. And there are a number of studies which have replicated that finding. So basically, it seems that anxiety tries to keep you alive until you reproduce, and it seems to be effective in doing that in certain ways. And then after you've reproduced, or after reproductive age, it cares a lot less about you, and is a risk factor for mortality.
Yeah, you see, I can see how the idea of anxiety evolving, this evolved emotion that helps you sort of be more vigilant and sort of thinking about the various outcomes of future scenarios, and it enables you to plan. But I'm wondering whether this phenomenon of acute extended anxiety, whether that specifically is more of a modern malaise, so to speak, because if we think back to, something like 99% of our evolutionary history was spent in small tribal nomadic societies, which are sort of inarguably way less complex than the modern life, even though harder, obviously. You're literally fighting for survival every day, but less complex. And so anxiety makes sense in that scenario. But, my experience was just acute anxiety for 4 years. And there's people that have it for 10 years, 15 years, where they're completely debilitated by it. Some people are bedridden by it. And I'm wondering what you think about that idea of it's maybe specifically a modern phenomenon, because our nervous systems just aren't wired for the sort of complexities of modern life. These threats such as, having debts and bills and whether or not you're going to lose your job. These were all things that these are phenomena that we didn't evolve with.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, in one sense, we do have a whole new set of challenges and threats, if you like, to call them that, today than we didn't have before. But I think it's difficult to argue that, 1,000 years ago or even 2,000 years ago, life wasn't even more difficult. With disease and poverty, conflict and war being the prime threats for our ancestors and things like that. My view of this is, again, that I don't think, from my reading of things, I don't think things have changed a lot. For example, you can find lots of examples of it from writers over the last century of people who've had lifelong anxiety problems, who've had obviously symptoms of panic disorder, for example, very bad symptoms of OCD for a lifetime. So I don't think this is particularly new. I think what is new is an understanding of what these conditions are, an understanding as well that they can come out of normal levels of anxiety, and that they can become so ingrained in the way that people think and do things that they're quite difficult to shake off. But I think that's always been the case.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether it was more an issue of complexity rather than difficulty. Do you know what I mean? By in the sense that in a say a 50-person tribal society, there's only there's a limited amount of relationships to keep track of, and you haven't got these more abstract issues such as whether the bailiffs are going to come knocking, and what the stock market's going to do, and whether or not you're going to lose your job, and what your politicians are doing. And I just sometimes wonder whether we in modern society just creates a sort of overwhelm of the nervous system. Especially for people that sort of predisposed to anxiety.
But no, I think you're right. I mean, again, I'm not sure that everything has changed. Even if when you go back to the 19th century, for example, we found that when people started to get comfortable in their lives, and started to feel reasonably safe during their lifetimes, their worries would go on to other things like status and so on. So they would always find something to be anxious or worried about, even in previous times. But one of the things that is, I think, highly stressful and in modern society is that with our increases in technology, we do tend to be multitasking a lot of the time. And multitasking, we know, is something that is stressful and causes, and causes changes in the brain, which then cause changes in stress hormones and so on. So multitasking is something that that we're doing a lot of now, and I think that's I think that multitasking is a real cause of a lot of the longer term stresses that we have. And again, I think technology, computing, the internet, and I mentioned these quite extensively in the book, you can see enormous sources of tension and anxiety that they produce, even though originally it was always assumed that having computers available and having an internet that connected people together was always seen as something that was going to bring people together and make their lives easier. I suspect that what's happened in reality is something quite different, and we know that the internet can be a very divisive and unwelcoming place, and we also know that we can have so many helpful things on our iPhones nowadays that we're multitasking the whole time.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is a good segue into actually sort of confronting this head on now. The idea of what are the modern causes of anxiety. Now, you go in depth into lots of different reasons in the book, but I was just wondering if you could maybe give us what you maybe consider whether the most significant from an epidemiological perspective, or the ones that are most interesting. But just what are some of the specifically modern causes of anxiety?
Well, the one that I single out in the book because it raises stresses and tensions and anxieties in many different ways is the internet, and a few simple examples from that are things like most of us do our shopping online now in some form or another, but it feels very remote from actually going to a shop and buying something. If you want to complain or if you get a wrong order, what you have to do to try and put that right seems very stressful indeed. And it's very different to actually stomping down to the shop and shouting at a shop assistant. You can't do that when you deal with stuff online. Multitasking is another thing. Again, the internet is asking you to multitask in many ways, in many different ways. One example I give in the book is that I always thought that students who came into my lectures with their laptops were actually typing notes into their laptops while they were listening to me. It was only when I sat at the back of the lecture theatre to actually observe another lecturer's teaching that I noticed what the row of students in front of me were doing. Two of them were actually on Facebook. One of them was buying something online. And only one of the 5 or 6 was actually taking notes, and one of them even just left the lecture midway through because they had a phone call on their iPhone. Now that's kind of not only was I very sad that people weren't focused entirely on the lecture, but clearly, they're trying to do a lot of different things at once. And we know that multitasking is something which does cause stress. The other aspect of modern day internet is, of course, social media. Now, here again is something that we, at its inception, we thought, well, this is going to be something that brings people together. It's going to make everyone feel connected. But for many people, it's done exactly the opposite. If you're on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, let's say you're a lonely person, a socially anxious person, all you see is what appear to be, and I stress appear to be, the rich lives, the rich social lives and achievements of other people. That's what it looks like, especially if you're a passive user. And these days, kids actually assess their likability by the metric of the number of friends they have on Facebook, not the true confidants they have. You only need 1 or 2 really good confidants who you can talk to and who will help you in times of need. Whereas if you have 250, 300 friends on Facebook, even that, managing that number of friends is often seen as being stressful. But what's interesting is social media can often make some groups of people feel even more disconnected than they would otherwise be.
Yeah, you see, and you've mentioned a couple of times that anxiety's probably been just as prevalent across any sort of generation, and people will always find something to worry about. Mm-hmm. But the idea that we had generations that went through just the past 100 years or so, the First World War, and then the Great Depression, then we had another war. Before all this was the Industrial Revolution, where everyone was basically living in poverty and working their asses off. Then we had the Cold War. Everyone was worrying about this mutual destruction or whatever the slogan was at the time. But this generation, my generation, and those younger than me, we've got it pretty good. I just find it interesting that, like you say, things like social media. A part of me, the sort of the cynical part of me, is a bit like, poor you with your iPhones and your ability to connect with anybody around the world at any time and stay in touch with all your family and your friends, and everyone's just a phone call away, and we're living in prosperous economic times, especially compared to the rest of history. And a very a cynical thing to say would be, what really have we got to be anxious about?
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's perhaps one way of addressing this issue is a study that was done that compared students in the 1960s with students in about 10 years ago in the 2000 and noughts. And it was an interesting study, and it showed that they asked students exactly what their aspirations were and what things they wanted to achieve in their life, and also looked at locus of control in these students. In the 1960s, people wanted to have a good, meaningful life and develop a philosophy of life, and they had a very self-focused locus of control, that they felt they were in control of their futures. 40, 50 years later, the whole thing's turned on its head, and we see now that students really they just want to be liked, they want to have a career, but they are very external locus of control oriented, in that they believe that their futures are very much in other people's hands and not in theirs. And that's a big change. Even despite all of the positives of technology and social change and so on, we've somehow created a generation of youngsters who don't feel they're in control of their lives. And I think, something as important as that, it may be to do with educational testing at an early age, for example. It may be something just as simple as one thing like that. But I suspect it's rather more than that. I suspect it's some of the negative sides of social media as well that makes people feel that they're not in control of their life. So something has changed. Something has changed in the last 50 years, quite fundamentally, to determine rather differently how our kids today actually see their future.
Yeah, it's fascinating that, we're sort of skirting around the realms of politics with this. You see, a lot of people would sort of say that this is, I'd ask the question of whose fault is that? Who's created this generation? Some people would point the finger at government and say, it's their fault. But then, if you get, I've interviewed a guy called William Epstein who, he's very cynical about the realm of psychology in general and of psychotherapy, and he says, it's nothing to do with government. It's to do with the fact that individuals are just naturally very selfish. I find it interesting as well that it's the same people that sort of blame government for a lot of things, about depression, anxiety, the way things are. There seems to be a modern insistence as well on handing more control over to the government, as well, as if the government are going to fix it. And I'm just wondering on that sort of that macro scale, Graham, what do you think? It's all well and good, going for individual therapy, but we're individuals rooted in a society. What do you think is to be done? Because we'll get to the individual level, but this idea of anxiety is an epidemic. What do we do about that?
Yeah, that's a tough one. That is the $1 million question.
What are your suspicions?
I think where we are now with let's say whole generations of our kids feeling that they're out of control of what's going to happen to them, out of control of their future, for example. I think there must be multiple factors that have contributed to that change. I think part of it is education, in the sense that we now intensively educate and test our kids, so they're much used to failure much earlier on than previous generations were, and it's that kind of we're sticking failure, the possibility of failure, in your head from a very early age now, and I'm not sure that's a particularly good thing. Again, I go back to social media here. It's very clear that everybody, when they're on social media, want to try and project the best of themselves, the best things they've done, things they've achieved, nice places I've been, all of these things, to make it look as that's the only aspect of their life. They want to be perfect, and they want to be seen as perfect. And we all know that perfect is completely unachievable. So again, that's going to make them feel rather out of control of what's happening to them. Government, I don't know. Clearly, governments have a big influence on our life. And we could spend probably many programs trying to go through how the way governments and government decisions and government policies and changes in those have affected the way that we perceive ourselves. But again, it is, I suspect, very complex.
What about just from thinking about it just from a purely psychological perspective? I mean, another argument is because things are so good now, it's not that things are so good, so why are you anxious? It's because things are good that people are anxious, that we've almost created like a, I'm just about squeezing the millennial generation, apparently, figures-wise, but my generation and below, the generations before us, have sort of made our generation weak. We've been raised weak. It reminds me of this. There's a quote by a fiction author called G. Michael Hopf, which was, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men then create hard times. And I wonder if we're sort of into that latter part now. I mean, you work in academia. We have things like, trigger warnings for students when we're going to be discussing complex issues. There was a study just published recently that it's something like 25% of students in I think it was the state of Alabama or Arizona in America claim that they're suffering from PTSD as a direct result of Donald Trump being elected president. I mean, what do you make of stuff like that, Graham?
Well, gosh, yeah, a few things there. Once you become aware once you become aware of mental health issues generally and what certain mental health conditions are, it's inevitable they're going to be applied across, in different situations. That will always happen. I think one of the things that I think we're less aware of is that we get contrast effects from one generation to the next as well. So, we have a generation of youngsters now who don't have very good sense of control over their own futures, and that may be because in the past others have. And so we may get contrast effects like that.
Mm. Yeah, I do. I think it's an interesting phenomenon. It's one that's sort of a bit controversial to talk about, precisely because people are so easily offended and anxious about talking about these things nowadays. But I don't know, maybe I'll have to. I think it's a topic I'm going to have to delve into and dedicate an episode to at some point. It's a highly requested topic anyway.
Yeah, I can believe, yes.
Yeah. So before we get into discussing what people can actually do about it, one of the things that I find most fascinating about anxiety as a mental health issue is why it tends to manifest in different ways in different people. So
right.
just for anyone that hasn't heard my story before, I'll keep this very short.
Yeah.
I trace the origins of my anxiety back to my business going bankrupt. And this back in 2008. I owned a nightclub business as a very young, ambitious, all this, and then went bankrupt. And then I just obsessed about it. I couldn't stop thinking about it for years. I was one of these guys, Graham, where years later, when it was already ancient history, and I was doing different jobs or whatever, and I was doing a driving job, and people would say, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" And it was like, "Oh, well, I drive for a living, but I used to own a nightclub." It was my whole identity. I couldn't let it go. And slowly but surely, it sort of ate away at me over time. But it ended up manifesting as agoraphobia, which I always thought was the most ridiculous sort of phobia. Like the idea that you're afraid of going outside, to me, still to this day, is comedic. I mean, and I can say that because I've been through it, but it's ridiculous. And I just wonder, what does the research say? What do we know about that? Why does anxiety manifest in so many different ways?
Gosh, that is the big question, and the simple answer is we don't know. We don't know at all. We don't really know in great detail how each of the anxiety disorders actually develop from normal levels of anxiety. We don't know that in too much detail. We got some good ideas. One of the things that we do know is fairly important when it comes to people developing an anxiety disorder, and I think this probably applies also to your own example, Danny, which is they're usually preceded by periods of intense stress in people's lives. Well, we know that. We know that can be found with panic disorder. We know it can be found with OCD, where not just traumatic distress or stress, but with just changes in responsibility. If you suddenly become a parent, for example, for many people, that starts to precipitate symptoms of obsessive compulsive disorder in some people, in a few people. So stress, we know, is a very important factor. What we don't know is how that stress affects people cognitively, how they think, and their physiology. And I suspect that an eventual explanation of how a stressor can elicit an anxiety disorder will be found in the way that the mind interacts with the body across those changes. And again, as I say, that's definitely the case. I mean, one of the things that we do know quite well from the point of view of anxiety anyway is that genetics is not a huge influence on anxiety. Genetics accounts for probably around 30% of the variance in levels of anxiety, which leaves much of the rest probably being due to environmental and experience factors. So it's what you experience that's going to affect whether you will develop an anxiety disorder or not. And that's certainly the case. What's interesting about genetic studies is they do say that if you have an anxiety disorder, then the probability, if your parents have an anxiety disorder, then the probability of you developing an anxiety disorder is slightly higher. But it doesn't specify what anxiety disorder you might have a higher risk of developing. So your parent may have obsessive compulsive disorder, but then as an offspring, you may have a slightly higher risk of developing anything, panic disorder, a phobia, which is really very weird, because the symptoms of each of those different anxiety disorders are very, very, very different. So we need to know a lot more about how stressors affect the way that people think, how they think about their physiological reactions to the stress, and so on. And at the moment, we don't know too much about that.
Well, I mean, what about the sort of middle ground there? I mean, like, genetics is obviously something there that's before you're born, and we've spoken about the way that we're sort of treating, adolescents, fledgling adults, and mollycoddling them. But like you just mentioned then about like parental influence, because like I said, I spent the first half of my life very stoic, which I got that from my dad. My dad never gave a toss about anything. Nothing worried me dad. Yeah. Whereas my mum was a worrier, and she still is. Yeah. And again, something that seems to be a modern phenomenon is can't let kids do anything. Don't let kids climb trees. Kids need protecting from this. Don't let them do that. Got to mollycoddle the kids. Do you think that plays a big part in it? And with how protective we are nowadays over kids, that we're going to create an even more anxious generation moving forward?
Yeah, I think it certainly plays a role. There's no doubt about that. There's quite a bit of research on the role of parenting and anxiety. I can just highlight two extremes. The two extremes are very overprotective parenting, and that covers things like what nowadays it's called helicopter parenting, where you're forever hovering over your kids and making sure that they're okay and that nothing bad happens to them. And then there's the other group I call the snowplow parents, who push forward in front of their children and getting rid of any obstacles whatsoever in their lives. And that those very overprotective parents, those children tend to grow up a little bit more anxious than parents who are not so overprotective, and there's good reason for that. The reasons are that if you're overprotective, your children will never learn to encounter as much threats and challenges and know how to cope with it. And they have to do that. I mean, I think that's important. A lot of research has been done on anxious mothers. Anxious mothers cause anxious children. This is often what we're told. And there's quite a bit of evidence that say that anxious mothers will overprotect their children. They will often point out threats and possible problems in things. And in doing that, you're just alerting the child the whole time to a threatening world. And those children tend to grow up a little bit more anxious than children who haven't had anxious parents. Now, having said that, we know there's an effect there, but it's not clear yet how big that effect is. It may not be a massively big effect. So, if you are that kind of parent, you're not suddenly condemning your child to a lifetime, an adult lifetime of high anxiety necessarily. That the effects might be quite small, but they're consistent. Then you go to the other end of the spectrum and you look at neglectful, inconsistent, and abusive parents. In that case, those offspring, those children tend to become very vigilant adults, right, who try to anticipate negative events, and often will develop pathological forms of worrying. And we know that neglectful and inconsistent parenting is a risk factor for generalized anxiety disorder, which is the anxiety disorder characterized by pathological worrying.
Yeah, I do find the whole childhood aspects of it fascinating, especially, I mean, the genetic thing. So I've got two kids, Graham. I've got one boy, one girl. The boy's, he's 8 now. My little girl, she's nearly 2. And they were raised exactly the same way. Same household, same parents, me and the mum still together. Same rules. Leanne, the mum, she's a bit, a little bit sort of wary about them getting up to mischief. I'm the one that's like, well, if they're not going to lose a leg, leave them to it. Whereas my little boy, no matter how much, encouragement, trying to get him to, integrate with other kids, is painfully shy, painfully anxious, scared to death of doing anything. Whereas my little girl, raised in literally the same house, same parents, same rules, she's ruthless. Nothing scares her at all. And that, I was always a sort of, in the nurture versus nature debate, I was always like, surely it's 95% nurture. But yeah, after this, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the usual thing that people are clinging on to with these episodes, someone sat at home, anxious, struggling with it. They're like, right, fine, theory. What do I do about it? And this, we could probably do an entire series on this.
Yeah.
So my question would be, so on your Psychology Today blog, you've got a post there which is like 10 tips for people to deal with anxiety. I'm going to pose this question as, if you could give us three things that are accessible and immediately sort of actionable to the individual, because when we get to things that are like the most effective, it would be things like being able to change. If if you're in an environment where you're poverty stricken or you're unemployed, obviously those things are going to help, but they're not immediately actionable. Same thing with even seeking a therapist. I always say to people, if you can find a therapist, get on it now. But then, in this country with the NHS, you've got a 16-week waiting list for most people. So if we could stick to actionable and immediate and for the individual.
Yeah, what I'll do is I'll give you three very broad domains of things you can do.
Okay.
And in the book, I do talk about the things you can do in those contexts in a little bit more detail. But three things that I think are important here, which hopefully you can action yourself in some ways. The first one is, these are all in relation to anxiety, of course, is boosting your mood. I think that the important thing to realize is that negative mood, feeling a bit distressed and feeling very negative, is not just an outcome of stress or anxiety. It causes negative changes in the way we think and act. So negative mood, and by negative mood, I mean things like sadness, anxiety itself, pain, tiredness, even hungover. All of those things are moods and things that we don't experience very positively. Trying to boost your mood is desperately important to try and make sure that you don't make things any worse. And so keep getting yourself into a positive frame of mind is important. And things, and I'm not just the only person who recommends these, but they're generally recommended is listen to some upbeat music. I think the song that came number one in that list of upbeat music to lift your mood was "Don't Stop Me Now" by
Queen.
Oh gosh, Queen, yeah. Don't Stop Me Now, Queen. But there's a whole list of those upbeat music songs, and as a way of boosting your mood. Laughter, again, I think always keep on your hard drive, on your TV box, or on your laptop, a program or a comedy program that you'll find humorous, that kind of thing. Take a walk around the block if you get the time, or have a relaxing bath. All of those things that I've just mentioned are all things which we have evidence that actually work in boosting your mood. So that's one thing that's quite important. And if you get into a routine of doing some of those things at particular times during the day, after you finish work, for example, then they will become a natural part of your life, I think. The second other domain, and this is equally important when it comes to all forms of mental health, I think, is living healthily. Because poor health and bad living are breeding grounds for anxiety and stress. Things like you should think about, and most people do anyway, is a balanced diet and a good night's sleep. Drink alcohol and caffeine in moderation, for example, and introduce some new activities in your life, as and when you can. And perhaps think about using mindfulness techniques. I've mentioned a few very basic mindfulness techniques in the book, and they help you to live in the moment rather than being trapped in an anxiety-threatened future that anxiety is created in your mind, and takes you away from those kinds of things. And the third general factor is understanding the causes of your anxiety. I know that everybody wants a solution, and that's only to be expected, but I think part of that solution comes by trying to understand where your particular form of anxiety came from. If you have an anxiety disorder and it's a very specific set of symptoms, then we can probably tell you a little bit about the factors that have actually led to you developing those symptoms, and understanding those symptoms and where they came from is, again, I think, very important. And it helps you to realize that anxiety can't harm you. Many forms of anxiety and many anxiety conditions and disorders, people feel that something bad is going to happen. But anxiety can't harm you. Even if you have something like panic disorder, where you think you're going to have a heart attack, you're going to pass out. Now, you're not. If what you have is panic disorder, it's harmless. And that's anxiety is a natural emotion that's important. And once you start to understand the causes of your anxiety, perhaps you should try to avoid avoidance, because there will always be things that you find threatening, challenging, or you're fearful of. If you're anxious, avoiding doesn't help. Trying to actually address some of those issues, seeing what's in the closet, as I call it, is quite important.
Yeah, I'm gonna. I think I'd feel remiss if I didn't sort of stick my oar in here a bit, Graham, just because it was, this was my thing, and I had a few sort of epiphanies along the way, and I'm not going to go too much into them now. I will get round to sort of sharing these a bit later on, and be interested to know if you think any of these are sort of misplaced, because often you can give advice that works for you, and then it's maybe not such good advice in a more general sense. The first one for me was to stop trying to figure it out. So I know you've just said learn about it and figure out the causes. My advice on that would be do that, but just do it once. So, listen to this episode or buy Graham's book, read it, and then have done with it. Because otherwise, I got into that habit of I just became obsessed with it. And reading one book after another, waiting for this epiphany, this one line, this one paragraph that was going to make everything click into place and make the anxiety go away. And while you think you're trying to figure it out, what you're really just doing is indulging in it and sort of perpetuating the problem. You've made anxiety your identity. Change your scenery, or your routine. Just do something instead of sitting there on the internet on the anxiety forums. Get out and do something. Change your routine, because that's part of falling into those old habits of cognition, so to speak. And attached to that is don't wait to feel like it. When whether it's exercise or meditation, wait to feel like it. Wait till you feel like you're in the mood. But if you do that, you're going to end up waiting forever. One of the big lessons I had from a guy called Tim Pitchell, who we interviewed back in, I think, like episode 9 or 11, one of his big things is that emotion follows motion. You might not be in the mood, you might be too tired to exercise or not in the mood to meditate, but just do it, start doing it, and then the emotion will flow from that a bit later on. Another one was when it comes to things like if you're anxious about you've lost your job or whatever, or it's big sort of environmental circumstantial issues that you're dealing with, and maybe you've got sort of very little power to affect that, still do whatever you can. So if you are unemployed, or you've just lost your job or whatever, even if you just start maybe applying for a job, even no matter how unrealistic it is that you're going to fix it in the short term, if you're doing anything towards fixing your situation, pulling whatever little strings you can, that should go some way towards feeling like you're being proactive and mitigating your circumstances. And then the final one would be consistent. It's so easy to try meditation or exercise 3 times and then go, oh, it didn't work for me. Bollocks to it. That's a big one. With my agoraphobia, I've got a diary of this that I need to publish. It took me, Graham, 96 days in a row of leaving the house and walking around the block before the nausea and the dizziness and the depersonalization finally started to abate. 96 days. So
I had very similar experiences. Yes.
So there we go. That's me sticking my oar in. So before we're going to be skipping into the quickfire questions portion in a minute, which, as you all know, is only available to supporters on Patreon. But before we do that, Graham, if you could just tell the listeners any website, social media. Obviously, you've got the book.
Yeah, a lot of what we talked about today is from my forthcoming book, The Anxiety Epidemic, which is published by by Little Brown Books, which is Robinson's. It's due to be published on the 8th of November, so by the time you hear this, it will probably be in the bookshops and available on Amazon. Do have a look at it, and if you have any thoughts on either the book or the things I've talked about, please feel free to get in touch with me by email. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, my handle is at Graham C.L. Davey. That's all one word on Twitter. And like I said, if you have any thoughts on anything that we've talked about or in the book, don't hesitate to get in touch with me.
Yeah, and also there is the Psychology Today blog, and also your own website as well, Papers from SIDCUP. Yep. So I will include, as always, all those links, the website, Psychology Today, and a link to Graham's book. They'll all be included in the show notes. Just go to myownworstenemy.org. And you'll find them there. Okay, let's jump in, see how many of these we can blast through. You get the first one free. After that, you're going to have to chuck a couple of dollars our way. So the first one, Graham, is what is the last book you read and then the best book you've ever read?
Oh, gosh. The last book I read was probably Stephen Hawking's book on... was it A Short History of Time? I can't even remember the title.
A Brief History.
A Brief History of Time, yeah. I read that. I tend to read stuff, because I do a lot of reading and writing anyway, I tend to read stuff during holidays, and that's one of the books I took on holiday with me recently, and very much enjoyed reading it. I'm very much into pop sci-fi.
Yeah, that one's been sat on my shelf for a couple of years. I need to get round to that one. He actually released another one called A Briefer History of Time because people like me were too lazy to read the first one. So what's the best book you've ever read?
Oh gosh, it's probably a novel. In terms of novels, I'm not a great novel reader, but when I do read a novel, I tend to pick ones that I pretty much know I'll enjoy. And Laurie Lee's Cider with Rosie as an excellent, one of the best pieces of written work that I've ever read, I think. But that I read that a long time ago. I'm
not familiar with that one. What's that about, just briefly?
It's about a young boy growing up in Somerset, and it's just about, his experiences as a young boy out in the country, and his first drink of cider and his first girlfriend. Right. And it's a very enchanting story.
Okay, cool. Right, here we go. If you could, we've sort of covered this, but I'd be interested to see your answer to this one now more directly. If you could take the reins of power at the Department of Health, what policy would you implement to improve the mental well-being of the general public? And I always say, think dictatorially, benevolent dictator, but there's no budget restrictions.
Yeah. Okay. One of the first things I'd do was increase
Okay, folks, if you enjoyed this episode or you're enjoying this podcast in general and you'd like to help support it, this is just a quick message to let you know that you can now join our little exclusive members-only community over at Patreon, where for as little as $2 a month, you can gain access to exclusive content like the quickfire questions portion from my interviews and my AMA or Ask Me Anything episodes. There's also a members-only newsletter where I give you a little sneak peek into what kind of guests and content to expect over the coming weeks. You can help me steer the ship a little bit by telling me the kind of content you'd like me to produce, and there's also the opportunity to join a private Facebook group where you can interact directly with myself and fellow patrons to share tips and advice and support one another on your own mental health recovery journeys. So if this sounds like a community you'd like to be a part of, please go to patreon.com/myownworstenemy and sign up for as little as $2 a month, which, let's face it, is less than the price of a coffee, and not even one of them like fancy double Belgian chocolate latte bollocks. It's probably cheaper than like a plain old shitty Nescafe from the office vending machine, and it won't give you the jitters or make your breath smell of arse, so bargain. Alternatively, for those of you who do want to help support the podcast, but you can't be arsed with all the extra bells and whistles, you can make a standard one-time or monthly donation by going to our support page at myownworstenemy.org/support. And that's about it. So, as always, thank you for listening, and I'll see you again next time.